Hello learners, welcome to this module on Indian writing in English. Today I am going to talk about Kamala Das, a famous Indian writer or a poet. Now, to begin with, I would rather come up with a question, what kind of poet is Kamala Das? Or probably what are her works famous for? So we normally try and understand, is Kamala Das an autobiographical writer? Is her poetry something that talks about or reflects the instability of her poetic persona? So what do you understand by her poetry? And what is the poet trying to convey through her poetry? This is all we're going to talk about. Now, the poet Kamala Das is forever associated with the history of Indian feminism. I would rather go to the extent of saying that she is the earliest profounders of Indian feminist trends, because in her writings we find joys and sorrows of the women folk. She beautifully reflects the entire journey of a female joy, of a female sorrow, with the most effective efforts. So whatever she writes, her pen always wants to capture some of the most problematic issues of the Indian society, particularly the problems of women. So to understand her writings, we need to also understand or know a little about her personal life history, which is very intricately connected to her actions, because we cannot understand Kamala Das without trying to understand her personal life history. Now, in her personal life, Kamala Das always felt, she came across the extreme traumas of domestic life. It is believed that her married life was a complicated one, and she saw the breakdown of relationships. So she had to suffer the turmoils of a broken married life. She saw the dominance of patriarchy. All her dreams, her hopes and desires, all her healthy consciousness, I would say, was ruined or broken. So the total chaos was, it had an influence on her personality, because I would rather say that it was the tremendous force behind her writing some of the most read, often referred pieces of Indian English literature. A brief summary of her life. She was born in Kerala in 1934. Her mother was also a well-known poet and writer who wrote in Malayalam. She spent her early years in Calcutta, where she went to a Catholic school. She also spent some of her years in a boarding school. She was married at a fairly early age before she could finish her college. We can also say that she is perhaps the only leading Indian English poet without a degree. She began writing pretty early in life and published her first poem in the Indian Pen. She was also published by C.R. Mandy in the Illustrated Weekly of India. Her important collections are Summer in Calcutta, The Descendants, The Old Playhouse, and other poems. So the first volume of her collected poems was published in 1984 and won her the famous Sahitya Academy Award. Now, besides poetry, she also wrote short stories, a few of which were collected in The Doll for the Child Prostitute, and other stories and novels. Now, two of her later works, Manas in 1975 and Alphabet of Lust in 1976, are of great importance. She also wrote her autobiography, My Story, which was published in 1974. So, Kamala Das has often been referred to as a confessional poet. So, there's no doubt that her poems are accounts of her deep personal experiences. But more than being a confessional poet, it is the brutal frankness with which she writes her verse, and this brutal directness or frankness is something which attracts the readers. She writes about the sexual frustrations. She also talks about the sexual desires. She also does not hesitate to talk about the suffocation that she dealt with of an arranged marriage where there is no love. So she also talks about the numerous affairs of a female. She also talks about the futility of lust, of the shame and sorrow of not finding love after repeated attempts. She analyzes loneliness and neurosis that stalks women. So, all right, she is a confessional poet, but she talks about all these various elements with directness, without any hesitation. She is brutally frank when she talks about, or when she addresses all these elements. Now, her poetry is not confined to talking only about her personal distress, but it also brings out her outrage against the social norms of a patriarchal society. So now, there are three important things that we've understood. She talks, or she addresses the issues which normally people would hesitate to address in those times, and apart from talking about her personal distress, she also, expresses her outrage against the social norms of the society. She was featured in Time magazine for breaking the sexual barrier. And this is how, she was somebody who brought new subject matter into Indian English poetry. So a whole range of her experiences, which were never spoken about, were introduced for the first time to Indian English poetry by Kamala Das. And I would like to quote Bruce King, who says, "Rather than finding salvation in art, Kamala Das's poetry spoke of fantasies, many lovers, and the continuing disappointment of love." She was no doubt a prolific poet and a writer. She wrote with honesty, and she tried to strip off the cover of conventional social morality. She addressed a lot of themes, including the role and position of women in a patriarchal society. She also addressed the issue of the autonomy of women, primarily the lack of autonomy of women in the patriarchal society, the lack of autonomy in the use of their minds and bodies, where she talks about her childhood memories, her sensuous enjoyment of nature, love, liberty, and there are many other concerns which she talks about. Now, Kamala Das is often addressed too as a rebel. She was also an iconoclast, provocateur, leader. So I would say she was all of these and also more. She was occasionally criticized for, to try to, she tried to kind of seek attention. So probably she was criticized to address these issues for the cause of seeking attentions. So, they were referred to as attention seeking tactics. But what happened was, she was for most of the part recognized to be a formative, and she also had foundational influence on the younger generations of Indian poets writing in English at all times, because all of them were trying to evolve genres in the post-colonial context through different channels. Now, when we talk about an introduction, a poetry by Kamala Das, an introduction also resonates the same voice. It engages with the ongoing dialectics of literary conversations and evolving tastes. The point of view expressed in this poem are significant because they talk about, and they're significant to the modern Indian writer trying to write or practicing her art in a world which is ethnically diverse, full of multilingualism, polyphonous, and we can also say often contentious, of creative accents. So, Kamala Das tries to depict the politics and power of the nations controlled and dominated by only the few patriarchy or I would say few men. This is what she talks about in introduction. She also tries and advocates the use of English language, and her advocacy of English language is highly discouraged by her critics. The poem further depicts how early marriage leads her to traumatic frustrations, because she does not conform to the ideas of a marriage or the societal norms. Her quest for true love rejects a typical love making. And in her poem, which is entitled The Sunshine Cat, she talks about the life of a person who is no other than Kamala Das. So it is truly autobiographical in that sense, and it discloses her sexual life not only with her coward and selfish husband but also with other men, leading her to disillusionment. So, the claustrophobic domesticity, which is primarily modeled by her husband, leads her to chronic depression and enslavement. Her revolt, that is how she revolts against the established patriarchy for weakening her fundamental rights and her self-identity. So, I would say that it is very interesting because in the introduction, the poem, what happens is, it retains the freshness and relevance even today. It explores the position of the poet, and it tries to show how in a very complex geometry of spaces which are occupied by individuals, racial, social, familial, biological and artistic, Das has tried to, stand alone as a figure in the center. You can refer to her as a voice from the margins. And she is somebody who is an essentialist, a female essentialist. She walks with characteristic confidence into the strident debate on political awareness in the opening lines of the poem, where she declares, "I don't know politics, but I know the names of those in power and can repeat them like days of week or names of months, beginning with Nehru." So, power is an important concept, it is an important construct, and it is something which is correlative in her poetry, and it is perhaps fitting also because that she uses this word at the outset of the poem And in the process, while she is invoking the rhetorical energies at work in a newly independent nation, the hollow epistemology of a cursory familiarity with merely the names of leaders, evident in a mechanical manner, the hypocrisies and the affectations that often attend political posturing, and by extension the sense of entitlement permeating the masculine outlook in the man-women relationship in general. So, she's trying to address these kind of things. The reference to Nehru in particular points to the perhaps the ubiquity of politicians in Indian life and the anglicized elite which he represented. So, Das extends the notion of politics from its conventional narrow associations with statecraft and governance to the nuanced discourse of patriarchy and its manipulations of female autonomy, and to that of linguistic anxieties inherent in a polyglot, class stratified post-colonial context, which attaches value to the different languages in use according to the social conditioning of its calibrated categories. So, both sexual and linguistic politics, as everyone understands, involved the power in their own ways. So, one primarily we can say through gender and the other through race, ethnicity and class. So, we can say that Das is referring to a dual disempowerment, which is kind of summed up later by the post-colonial critics as the double displacement of women in their capacities as colonial subjects and patriarchal victims. Now, what happens is, when we are trying to understand, Kamala Das and her poetry, equally important is her experimentation with language, because as we see in an introduction, she began to use Indian English not in the ironic and comic manner, rather unself-consciously, unaffectedly and very naturally. So, not being a foreign returned English teacher, she had no qualms about using a language which she was comfortable and familiar with. Rather, she used the language, in a very unaffected and natural manner. I would again like to quote King when he says, "More important than its themes was the use of an Indian English without the concern for correctness and precision which characterized most earlier modern verse. Instead, it appeared unpremeditated, a direct expression of feelings as it shifted erratically through unpredictable emotions, creation of its own form through its cadences and repetitions of phrases, symbols and refrains." Unquote. While reading the poems, we also need to analyze whether the form reflects something, of the instability of the poetic persona. So, Kamala Das, she exhibits her quest for her individuality besides talking about the feminine identity that is being subordinated by the male-dominated society. As a confessional poet, Das also realizes her psychological or inner burden with openness and her great conviction in quest for her own identity in her poems. The two poems, An Introduction and The Sunshine Cat, which are taken from Summer in Calcutta, they are full of revelations. So, whatever revelations made by Das in her poems, they are all about her personal life and her own experiences. She rebels against the traditional gender role imposed on women. She talks about, particularly on her, by the patriarchal society of her time. And the poems also talk about the pains and the miseries and the frustrations that engulfed her throughout her life. Let's talk about, in a couple of minutes, about the structure of the poem and introduction, which is, it is a loosely structured poem of 59 lines included in The Summer in Calcutta, and there is no visible rhyme scheme, and Das is also not using meter in a very consistent manner. The lines break and they are dictated by, natural pauses or breaks in the meaning. So we come across a certain disjointedness in this poem, and rather this disjointedness makes this poem more conversational and more immediate. So in her poetry, the distance between the poet and the poetry is collapsed. There is no distance. As we read her poetry, as we evolve in the process, we also evolve in the process of learning a lot about Kamala Das. So, and that is why we say that the confessional element in the poetry operates at the technical level also. This certain disjointedness in the poem. When she see, notice the first lines or the first sentences when she says, I don't know politics. So it has nothing to do with the second line. The poem may as well have begun with, I am an Indian, very brown, something, something. But the first sentence has an oblique connection with the subject of the poem. So, this is what we have to understand. The poet also disclaims any special knowledge of politics, and she just hesitates, or she just, refuses to provide an artistic and autobiographical rationale for the language or of her creative expression. So, English or her use of English is kind of a defense, if not an apology, for writing in English. Now, her writing in English, as we all understand, is more than just a cultural or a artistic choice. It has its politics as well. It's just not confined to because it was an artistic choice or a cultural choice, but she also wanted to deal with the politics of using English, or the issue of writing in English has been politicized for more than 100 years. So to speak out against this, the first thing that Das does is to claim an apolitical position for herself. She couldn't care less about politics and politicians, she implies, because the indifference then gets translated into a demand for artistic and personal freedom of expression. So she says, why not leave me alone? Critics, friends, visiting cousins, every one of you, why not leave me speak? Why not let me speak in a language I like? So in any language I like, there is a certain anger, certain frustration at attempts by others to control or restrict her. So the poem also goes on to become an elaborate justification of the kind of poetry Kamala Das writes and the kind of language she uses. So, the language I speak becomes mine, its distortions, its queernesses, all mine, mine alone. It is half English, half Indian, funny perhaps, but it is honest. It is human as I am human, don't you see? So, Indian English, both linguistically and culturally, hybrid and half caste, is passionately defended in the poem. So, in a society obsessed with hierarchy and purity. Even sometimes it is obsessed of the privileged status as English became. When you began to write poetry in it, it is kind of seen as an act of betrayal and as an evidence of bad faith. So, Kamala Das's poetry and her poem is a plea for more than artistic freedom or for expression in Indian English. There is also a passion in the appeal which comes for a defiance of those who wish to silence her poetry. She says, I am a human being. The poet screams, I have a right to my voice. No one should try to silence me. My voice is like the cawing of crows and the roaring of lions. So if you don't deny them the right to their voice, why are you trying to, silence me? The subtext is very clear. Are you trying to gag me because I am a woman? The silencing of the voice of women and of the oppressed is a common fact of the history of all civilizations, and it is the elites, the culture defining groups who always speak on behalf of their less privileged fellows. She says, let me speak, don't try to shut me up. And she begins to tell her story as she is talking of her loneliness, her lonesome childhood, her growing up years. So, she talks about, she's perhaps, unprepared for the married life that she comes across. And also, the entire experience seems to be a crucial one for the poet. It creates a wound in her psyche which never heals, and it leads to her expressing this personal experience. The poet tries to deny her femininity by dressing like a man, cutting her hair short and so on. Actually, the revulsion seems to stem from what men do to men. So again, the impositions of social norms, dress in sari, be girl, be wife, they said. The whole package is flung at her. She rebels not consciously or deliberately, but she does so compulsively and traumatically. So, this is what we've tried to understand in the poetry of Kamala Das. And her autobiography kind of, she suggests the breakdown of her personality. She becomes a rebel. So, the entire poem shows a great incoherence which is suggestive of a breakdown in personality, her compulsive behavior, her the inevitable reaching out to another man, the rejection that follows, and a devastating indictment of the male. So when she says he is every man, who wants a woman? And it is like, I who drinks at 12 midnight in hotels in strange towns. So the poem ends on an uncertain note, the poet seeking not much more than to survive, to earn the right to be simply called I. Thank you.